Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. Thank you for joining us today for our session, Frontier Markets on the Cusp of the Great Leap Forward. This session will look at a number of markets across Africa, from DRC to Angola to the Sahel, and ask the questions. What conditions need to be in place for the banking industry in these markets to flourish? My name is Jumoke Jagundokumu. I am IFC's Regional Director for Eastern Africa, based in Nairobi. IFC is proud to co-host the Financial Industry Summit, and I am looking forward to the discussion over the next hour. If you're on social media and you'd like to tweet about this session, please use the hashtag AFIS2021. We have an excellent panel joining us today. From the World Bank, my brother and colleague, Mr. Usman Diagana, Vice President for Western and Central Africa. From the beautiful country of Angola, we have Mr. Otoniel dos Santos, the Secretary of State for Finance and Treasury. We have Madam Mary Wamae, who is the Group Executive Director of Equity Group Holdings. And we have Mr. Mustafa Rauji, CEO of Royal Bank. Also joining us today is Mr. David Cohen, Chief Economist for Africa at Citibank. A warm welcome to our panelists and guests. I'd like to remind everyone that we have only 1 hour for this event, and we would like to leave some time at the end to take questions from the participants who are watching today. For this reason, I would really like to ask all our speakers to please keep their responses to 2 minutes each time so that we can have a lively discussion and strong engagement. Before we go to the questions that I have for each of you, I'd like to invite David to please share with us a brief presentation to help give us some context around this discussion. We'll hear from David on growth and growth prospects in frontier markets, income levels, and a few other highlights. David, over to you.
Thank you very much, Jamoke. I put together a little presentation, and you should be able to see the slides as we go along. But look, when I was approached by the organizers to talk about frontier markets in Africa, I looked at the 3 countries that we were dealing with. I did have a little joke with them saying perhaps it should be pre-frontier markets that we're looking at here. But I actually got to thinking about it in a little bit more detail. And I actually realized that it's actually quite complicated to work out what a frontier market is in Africa and how you think about it. So the obvious starting point, I think, when most people think about frontier markets is to think about economic growth. Now, these are the markets in Africa that have the most growth potential going forward. But of course, the problem with that is that if you look at the graph that's up there, it'll show you that, yes, Ethiopia has been one of the fastest growing African economies for the last decade, if not the fastest. Cote d'Ivoire might argue with them over that. But if you look at the other 2 economies that we had mentioned at the start, Angola and the DRC, yes, both were growing very strongly for the first half of the last decade. But with the end of the commodity super cycle, Angolan growth actually took a huge negative downturn. Angola has grown negatively for the last 5 years, probably making it one of the worst performing economies in Africa. The DRC has been up and down a little bit. And so the problem you have then is the past a good guide to the future in terms of growth? And that's the big question that we have to think about. The other point is, of course, that in the last few weeks, you've seen the oil price recover. And in the last few months, we've seen the copper price recover, which is of infinite importance to the DRC. And so you'd say, okay, these economies are going to grow again. But is growth based on commodity prices the sort of growth you really want to encourage? Most of us think, no, we want more sustainable underlying growth than commodity-driven growth. And so that would be another conundrum that we would have to face. So look, if we look at the next slide, what it shows you is I think there's 3 things to think about which make a frontier market. The first is probably political change. Now, this doesn't have to be disruptive political change. If you think about it, in all the three countries that we had in the introductory slide, Angola, the DRC, Ethiopia, you have seen political change. We have seen the end of the Dos Santos government in Angola, a peaceful transition to the Lorenzo government, and that has led to a political opening. Similarly, in the DRC, we've then seen the end of the Kabila era, whether we think of whichever Kabila we think of. And that's perhaps even one of the most interesting ones, because many people were even skeptical about the end of the Kabila era. But now what we're seeing with the new prime minister and the new president taking a greater firm control, it's very interesting how that may play out. And of course, in Ethiopia, we saw the arrival of Abiy Ahmed and the end of the EPRDF rules. So, right, we've had political change. But political change in itself is probably not the only thing that's required. You also need this second point, the prospects for economic and structural reform. And that's where it becomes really interesting. What you see in all three countries is that they've recently signed IMF programs. IMF programs do help solve two problems. They're not the solution to everything, but they, one, put the exchange rate policy firmly at the center. If I talk to any investor in Africa, being able to convert currencies is the key issue, and currency inconvertibility is one of the biggest disincentives to investment. And then they bring in a period of stabilization. What you really want, though, then, is this structural reform underneath it that makes these markets really attractive. We're starting to see some of that in Angola with the privatization program. Clearly, in Ethiopia, with the offering out of telecom licenses and potentially banking sector licenses, we're beginning to see that. In the DRC, I suspect that many of these things will come as the politics stabilizes and we move forward. You've got the two steps, political change, the opening up of the economy. But look, you could argue that this applies to more than just these economies, right? I put a list of economies here that could also say they've been through a similar thing. Algeria, the Gambia, the Seychelles, Zimbabwe, Sudan. That's a pretty wide grouping of countries when you think about it, right? But they've been through political change and that. And that highlights two things. And we'll jump to the next slide to talk about income, but it also highlights something. Frontier markets. What did we entitle the session? The great leap forward. Remember that frontier markets can emerge, they can submerge, and then they can re-emerge, right? There's not a straight line on all these things, right? And this is one thing I really want to stress to people out there. Nothing is a straight line. And that when you invest in these countries, you have to have your time horizon right. Where am I going to be in 10 years' time, 5 years' time, 15 years' time? These are the key things that all executives think about. But the other point is that, look, if you look at this slide, what I'm showing you is that these countries have huge variations in income level. If you widen out our definition of where the new ones are, it's not necessarily that they're poor, but they have higher, lower income levels. Now, look, I've done another slide for you that shows this very interesting. If you look at the next slide, which shows you a combination of income and population, this may be the key slide to understanding what's going on. Yes, we can look at poor, big population countries, Ethiopia, the DRC. But we could see just as much potential in countries like Angola and Algeria, which have a higher income but a slightly sort of middling population, around 30, 40 million people. But it's just as possible that people could see an opportunity in the Seychelles. The Seychelles has very high income levels and could well provide you depending on your business. Similarly, there's some interesting ones. The Gambia. The Gambia may not be interesting to some of you, but if you're a neighbor like Nigerian banks or companies, you may see the opportunity on your doorstep, right? And it's the proximity that can make a big, important difference to you, right? And then even within that, remember you have the complexities. The DRC is not one market. The DRC is at least three markets I have it. It's Kinshasa, it's Goma region next to East Africa, and then it's Katanga in the south next to the Zambia and the Copper Belt and more tied into the South African economy. So there's all these complexities. And there's the one country that I haven't quite managed to fit into any pigeonhole there, the Sudan, which I'm still working on, but I think provides a lot of opportunity and maybe the forgotten frontier market of Africa. So a little bit, two things I'll say finally before I hand to the distinguished other panelists. The first is that, look, we're on a financial sector panel, so let's have a look at banking penetration. The one point I would want to tell you is that whatever the income level, if you look at that graph, it's showing you that banking penetration, and this is done as banking sector assets as a percentage of GDP, is low. If I was to do that graph across Europe, Japan, the US, all these numbers would be well over 100% of GDP. So whatever you think about, some even 200% of GDP. So whatever you think about, there's huge opportunities in the markets. Really, it doesn't matter so much about their income level across Africa. That's the prize. The complexity in all this, and I hope some of the panelists will talk about it, and if we look at my final slide, is that you still got to decide how you're going to access this market. Now, this is a graph that what it's showing you essentially is the number of bank branches per 100,000 of the population. And the point I show you that graph is that, look, yes, we could all go down a traditional European banking model where we have lots of branches, but of course we might not. It depends how we think technology is going to play out across the African continent and whether you're going to penetrate some of these markets through IT, through mobile money, through other forms of banking. Yes, I accept that branches will exist for a long time because people still like to see branches. They provide some representation of permanentization, right? And they're useful marketing tools for people. But the other point of these frontier markets is that you have to think how your business model will work into the complexities of the market and how you can adapt it to meet the population and its demands going forward. And that's the key to thinking about frontier markets. Where do I fit in that niche? Look, I work for Citibank. We're never going to have a large number of branches across Africa, but we have an important niche in servicing our multi-country clients who have dealings across the whole of Africa. Some of the other panelists will have completely different niches. So I certainly know Equity Bank's niche very well in this, right? So I'm very conversant about that. You could argue we're at polar opposites of the scale, nearly, right? But a frontier market still needs both types of banks. So the point I would say in my summary, frontier markets are not easy to define, but I think there's a point in countries where they go through a political change that allows an economic program to be put in place and an opening up, and therefore it can move ahead from that point. It won't move in a straight line. Like I said, some markets will submerge, some will go backwards, some will go forward. You have to stay in there for a long time, and you have to be very clearly focused, particularly in the financial sector, on where your niche is, how I fit that niche, and what time frame I'm going to deal with. And I hope all those points will be illuminated by our distinguished panelists going forward. So I will hand up.
Thank you very much, David. Thank you very much, David. You have painted a picture for us and asked us questions as to whether the past is a good indicator of the future, that it's not in a straight line. We need to think about some other countries as well, and what will technology do in this instance. So panelists, David has shared this context. Well, you are living and breathing it every day. Let me now open up for discussion. Usman, will come back to you in a few minutes. Let me start with Otoniel, Mary, and Mustafa. So Otoniel, welcome. In the description about this session, the Africa CEO Forum named Angola as a country that has been left behind when it comes to investor interest in the banking sector. Does Angola deserve this label? Tell us what you and your colleagues in government and the private sector in Angola are doing to change this narrative.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Jumoke. Actually, we believe that Angola does not deserve this label, not only because everything that we are doing now, but actually what we did before. Although we know that regarding the foreign direct investment between 2015 and 2017 had a diminishing from 15 billion to $6 billion. We had a slight boost in 2019 that reached 30% variation to $8 billion. Actually, we believe that also our banking sector we have 25 players in total, and 5 of those players are international banks that represent 11%, 20% of the market. and they have something like 11% of the total assets of the market. We believe that this is something that is in a shape that could grow, and for that, all the commitment that we have in government to a gradual and also appropriate financial reforms to keep the confidence of all those players that we have already in our market, and make possible other players to come to our market and also have all the possibilities that the market could give to them.
Thank you, Tony. I'll come back to you. Let me go to Mustafa right now. Mustafa, welcome. Could you tell us about the case of DRC? What was the genesis of the banking sector reforms there? And where do things start now? How open is DRC's banking sector for business?
Without wanting to go into too much history, I feel that the initial genesis started off in the year 2000 when the then central bank governor allowed the economy to be dollarized. This, in effect, allowed savers in the DRC to have USD accounts, and they could sleep well at night knowing that their savings were in hard currency. Unfortunately, our emerging markets or frontier markets suffer from this phenomenon of hyperinflation. It comes in fits and bursts, but we just never get away from it. And for the last 20 years, we've also seen our local currency depreciate significantly. So I think the biggest impetus was the dollarization of the economy, and that's allowed us, if we look at 20 years, we had total assets in the banking system of $200 million. And today you look at total assets are roughly at about $10 billion. So over 20 years, that's a 50x growth. It's tremendous. At the same time, where do things stand now? So the market is about 18 players. We have 2 local banks, of which Raw Bank is one of them. And the competition is rife. We have West African banks in our market. We have Moroccan banks. We have South African banks. Citibank is a player in our market. And Equity Bank has been there for a couple of years and has recently reinforced its position with the acquisition of one of the leading and oldest banks, the BCDC. So people, I think, tend to underestimate the level of the products and services that are currently offered in the market. It's been a very competitive environment. I think it'll get increasingly competitive. I really liked David's chart about the 3-step change. And so we're living the political change that took place 2 years ago. And we're all waiting to see the structural reforms that are going to come into place with the new government that's currently being formed. If we are able to see the structural changes that we desperately need in this country, I feel the next 10 years are going to be transformative. The beauty of our market is that if you look at the number of branches per capita, as was really well showed in the previous presentation, is that I think that the transformation is going to come from us leapfrogging by using technology to deliver the power of financial services to what is essentially 80 million people. Let's call the last 20 years of the DRC somewhat of a normalization period for a country where the GDP per capita is where it is. But I feel the next 10 years is going to be transformative. I really have no doubts about it. I think all banks participating in this market must equip themselves for this. And we shouldn't overestimate what's going to happen in 2 years and underestimate what's going to happen in 10 years, as Bill Gates has famously said.
Yes.
You have to look at things with a 10-year horizon. And I strongly feel that the next decade is going to be one that's full of transformation in this market. So yeah, we're open for business.
Thanks, Mustafa.
Yeah.
Thanks, Mustafa. So Mary, welcome. You heard Mustafa. Equity Group is in expansion mode. You've just bought another bank in DRC. You have offices over Eastern Africa. And you also have an office in Ethiopia. What's the potential in this market? What is there to gain, not just for Equity, but for the countries themselves?
Thank you, Jumoke. First of all, to say that I'm delighted to be here today. Equity has a unique business model which is able to combine a very robust commercial engine with a very robust social engine. And we feel that entry into these markets will give us an opportunity to roll out that model, especially in big countries like DRC with the huge populations. And David, I totally agree with you. If you look at the model of equity, it is very well suited for the high density populations like DRC, Ethiopia, and that is really the biggest attraction. The other thing is that looking at the level of banking penetration, and this one we measure based on the level of access to financial services, it's been low rated in countries like the DRC, for instance. I think the last figures we had were just about 4% penetration, which may or may not be absolutely a good estimate, but it's around there, it's quite low. And we are seeing a big opportunity to be able to roll out the business model, create financial access, serve the unbanked populations in large scale, because our model is really a high volume, low margin kind of business model. And it's a big opportunity for us. And we also feel that we'll be able to deepen the financial markets. In terms of the bank itself, the attraction is also that we should be able to increase the contribution of the group subsidiaries to, right now it's about 40% with the acquisition of BCDC. We want to reach to about 60% business coming out of Kenya, both in terms of balance sheet size, and also the profitability. And we feel that we have a very good opportunity to do that. If I may just mention, and I totally agree with the previous speaker, the opportunity is very huge. When we entered the DRC in 2015, the balance sheet of ProCredit Bank was only $150 million US. By last year, before BCDC came in, that had grown to close to $1 billion US. Now, with the combination with the BCDC, by last December, it had grown to about $3 billion. We have grown the number of customers from less than 100,000 to about 800,000 within the span of about 5 years, because we went there in 2015. So for us, we are seeing a huge, huge opportunity. And also to mention David's point about rolling out technology, digital products. So we don't need to do very many branches. We have already started agency banking. We have rolled out mobile banking. So areas like the northern part, which are challenged with infrastructure, we are able to cover them very, very quickly and achieve scale within a very, very short time. So for us, it's ready for us. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Mary. So I'm coming back to you, Antonio. What are some of the barriers that are in place that still make it difficult for investors to come into Angola? What are the difficulties in lowering those barriers?
Okay, thank you. I think that, as David said in his presentation, we have mainly two main topics that we have to address, and we are addressing. It comes right after the political change. No, we have to make strong commitment with fighting corruption. Looking very deeply on the economic diplomacy that is made, and also making a very good effort to everybody to understand that we have a very political goodwill on what regarding the private sector coming in the market. This is something that this is addressing by the government. On the other hand, we look at the doing business environment, which is also important, and we look at it with the World Bank as well. So we have a macroeconomic stabilization plan that is working on giving all the efforts and the conditions, focusing on stabilization and strengthening the fiscal stability, regarding reducing the inflation, promote a more flexible exchange rate regime, improving financial stability that will be made by changing some rules. We have a new central bank rule we have a new notice what was issued by central bank in 2019 that allow foreign investors to go out with their revenues through the market. So all the investors that invest in Bodiva, which is our exchange, could leave the market without having any exchange constraint. So the private state-owned banks, which are also in the privatization program. So we are working on all these barriers that we will make the market as a main hole to drive our economy. This is what we believe, that will lead also with some facilitation on having visas to come to Angola and to know the market and invest.
Thanks very much, Antonio. Mustafa, so you heard Mary earlier. She talked about what they have been able to achieve in DRC from 2015 to date, both the old bank and the new bank they have just acquired combined. So the question to you is, how important are new banking entrants for developing a banking sector in a frontier market? And are you seeing even more interest from other Pan-African banks? And what do you think it will do to the banking sector in DRC as a whole?
I think we welcome these moves from Pan-African banks into this market. I mean, what you have on one end is, from an international perspective, it creates a spotlight on the DRC when banks like Equity Bank make such big moves, and it attracts a lot of international attention. So I think overall, it sort of improves the prospects and the perspective, or at least the perception of the market, as more and more international banks do enter the DRC. At the same time, what we've seen, I mean, there's been a plethora of banks that have entered this market, either from Morocco, West Africa, or East Africa. And what we've seen is that each bank has still been able to grow. So what eventually it does is that it creates a deeper financial pool, which all banks participate in. So it's not so much a zero-sum game. I think it expands the entire pie. I think then all banks then can create their niches and play where they feel most comfortable. At the same time, it allows us to ensure that we're enhancing our value proposition to our customers. Evidently, international banks bring tried and tested formulas into this market, so they come with that knowledge. It ensures that we remain extremely competitive, and we're able to review and improve our value proposition to our customers to ensure that our products and services are appreciated by the Congolese population. So I think which from all aspects, it's generally very positive. And so we welcome this, absolutely.
Thank you. Mary, we know that doing business in frontier markets is not easy. We've talked about some of the constraints. Antonio has talked about the way they are trying to remove some of the constraints in Angola. So what are some of the challenges that you have faced in the recent expansion efforts? Doesn't have to be only DRC. And why does Equity continue to take the risk?
Okay, thank you again. One of the challenges, obviously, is the very different regulatory regimes. If you look at the rest of East Africa, we are on the English law, for instance, most of the countries, actually all of them. When we went to DRC, we found they are in OHADA law, which is very, very different. And you sort of have to just find your way around that. There's also the language barrier. When I go to DRC, right from the airport, everyone is merci, bonjour. I mean, I'm an English speaker. So that's also an issue that we are dealing with. I'm actually now learning French. I'm taking classes now, and I'm doing okay. So, but on a light touch.
I'm happy to teach you French anytime you come.
Oh, okay, great, thank you. So labor availability, I think it's also a challenge DRC, not so much, but if you look at countries like Tanzania, I think we have a challenge there, but we are overcoming it by more training, induction into the culture of the group, and we seem to be doing very well. The penetration of technology, obviously, it's also another aspect to look at, especially if we want to make the offering through technology, mobile banking. We are looking at how well are the customers equipped, for instance, to be able to enjoy the services. And of course, there's the well-known challenges of the infrastructure, which is a challenge not just to the frontier markets, but also to the more developed African countries. But the good thing to note is, obviously, from a policy issue, there's a lot happening in terms of improving the infrastructure in our various countries, and there's a lot of progress that has been made there. So those are some of the issues, but I would say that all in all, it's still very, very attractive, because the reverse of that challenge is that there's an opportunity to make a difference. So when there's an infrastructure challenge, what do? You come up with innovative products and services. And we are doing that also in countries like South Sudan, for instance, where we've rolled out agency banking, mobile banking very, very successfully, and the customers are now enjoying that. When it comes to labor, there's the opportunity to train, coach, and mentor. So we are doing all that. We are lobbying with the central banks for changes. I think we lobbied a lot. The tax regime in DRC has been improved significantly since our first entry. We were on a more than 50% effective tax when we started with ProCredit. That has now come down almost to the level of the other African countries, to about 30%. And we are lobbying now for approval of the digital products, and the central banks are very, very collaborative on that. Thank you.
Okay, so there is progress.
Yes, a lot of progress. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Thank you all very much for your interesting responses. Let me turn to Usman to get his perspective on all of this. Mary, Mustafa, Otonel, don't go anywhere. I'll be coming back to you in a few minutes. Usman, thank you again for joining us today. You oversee Western and Central Africa for the World Bank. Can you help us understand the economic context in which the banking industry is operating? What has been the impact of COVID?
No, thank you very much, Jumeke and colleagues, for the information and the comment. Those are very timely. Now, the country of Sub-Saharan Africa and the Sahel are witnessing on record their first economic contraction in almost 30 years as they grapple with the health and economic impact of the pandemic, aggravated also by security situation, especially in Sahel. So in that regard, the banking industry in Africa has not been immune to this type of a crisis and is currently functioning in an extremely challenging environment. Lockdown accompanied by declines in the commodity price, tourism, countries like Ethiopia, Kenya, Cabo Verde, remittances, Nigeria, Senegal, as well as disruption in global value chain, are resulting in an economic contraction in a continent already facing very low per capita incomes. So unless a strong focus on recovery is in place, 40 million people are at risk of falling into extreme poverty in the Sub-Saharan Africa region alone. So COVID-19 obviously has also exacerbated external imbalances, including a sharp reduction in remittances flows throughout Africa. The numbers are dramatic. Non-resident capital flows to the Sahel and Sub-Saharan African countries are estimated to have dropped by around 50% in 2020. Ultimately, sustained and resilient recovery will depend on how fast this country can design and implement policy action to prioritize public spending, catalyze private investment, and diversify their economy to create jobs and build back better. So the prospect for recovery so differ across Sahel and sub-Saharan African countries. For example, real output for oil-dependent countries, including Nigeria and Angola, is expected to contract in 2020, while other countries might be facing a slowdown. So resilient recovery in Sahel and sub-Saharan African countries will also necessitate a careful balance of intervention in the banking sector. Those that need to address challenges and weaknesses, and those that seize opportunity to leverage the force of the sector for recovery. As we are all aware, the financial system in sub-Saharan African countries are dominated by banks and are typically highly exposed to the public sector. Sovereign bonds represent a sizable share of commercial banks' total asset. The credit rating of commercial banks in African countries are highly dependent on the credit rating of the sovereign. Exposure to oil sector, including through lending to state-owned enterprise, has presented the risk also to banks in Africa, as you know. So the COVID-19 fiscal pressure on government finance has exacerbated the risk exposure of domestic banking systems, as banks have observed part of the higher public funding requirement, heightening the sovereign nexus exposure channel. So in that regard, central banks in sub-Saharan Africa have introduced several policy measures aimed at easing prudential requirement, including regulatory forbearance and temporary loan moratoria to ensure that the banking sector enjoys ample domestic liquidity and to maintain public trust in the financial system during these stressful times.
Okay, thank you very much, Usman. I'm going to have to move to, from some of what you have said, you've talked about the challenges of the banking sector. You've talked about the government undertaking reforms. So if I move it a bit to the challenges that some of the panelists have talked about in reforming banking sector in frontier markets, what advice do you have for promoting investments in the sector, private sector investments in the sector in West and Central Africa, maybe leveraging public sector? And what are the investments, what are the impediments to that, given the constraint that you have raised? And if you can keep that to 2 minutes, it would help us to go back to the other panelists.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much.
No, in the context, I think it's very important that the authorities in the country focus on policy measures for a coordinated response to support the recovery of the real economy, preserve financial stability, and ensure market continue to function. I can say here that we as a World Bank stand ready to provide capacity building to regulatory and operational capacity to authority and financial institutions to respond to the major priorities. This includes also leveraging the flexibility of regulatory, supervisory, and accounting framework, and continuing to uphold minimum regulatory standard to avoid any possible harm of the already fragile financial system. We believe also that effort needs to be in place to monitor risk and vulnerability and proactively and timely enact the required measures to safeguard the financial system against emerging risk and strengthen capital and liquidity buffers of the system. We know that the implication of the COVID-19 shock on the economy is there, and more firm along critical valuation will be placed under stress. So this is a consequence of this unusual situation that we are. So in that regard, authorities are also expected to encourage banks to prudently restructure loan and maintain the flow of credit to the economy. I think this will be extremely important for actually the whole financial system to recover. Finally, de-risking and public-private partnership remain another critical area where trust has to be rebuilt. Provide more reliable and transparent risk mitigation option to attract private capital, which will require ensuring a supportive, transparent, legal and regulatory framework have to be in place. So let me stop here.
Thank you very, very much, Usman. We appreciate this important perspective. Let me go back to our panelists for their reactions. Otoniel, you heard Usman refer to partnerships as part of the solution for many of the challenges. We know that to develop an economy, it takes a village. It takes partners from across sectors, institutions, as Usman mentioned. Who are the key partners needed to ensure the success of Angola's banking sector?
We think that historically in our country, and I totally agree what Usman said, especially in Angola, we were an economy that we had only two actors in the market, which was the state and families. But what we are trying to do now is to actually make the third person, a third player in the market, which is the private sector, companies that actually will lead the economy and be able to make the growth as something sustainable and as we believe that the market could bring. So by saying that, I believe that it's needed to make a community where everyone could feel a part of and having a voice in order to be able to play in the market a very strong role. We believe that working with some foreign entities such as World Bank or IMF and also IFC could help to bring those knowledge, but not only, also some region players, some region partners, and as I said before, all that is going aligned with the political or economic the diplomacy that is made. Those players could help us to establish the framework that will bring transparency, confidence, and will boost the market.
Thanks very much, Antonio. Mustafa, I mean, Angola is here. We can see Angola is a proxy for all the countries we've been talking about. The World Bank is here. What types of support do banks need from external stakeholders? What is your ask of the government of DRC in order for Raw Bank and banks like it to grow? And what is your ask of development institutions like the World Bank and the IFC? I know many questions in there, but also if you can try to keep it to 2 minutes.
Sure. I'll do my best to answer 3 questions in 2 minutes. Jumoke, I think, look, I'm a firm believer in private sector-led development. I really think that if the government of DRC provides us with the right legal framework that we need and the fiscal reforms that we have, we in the private sector will continue to compete with each other for new markets and will continue to develop the economy and put finance in the hands of the people and finance the economy. If we are, and I think it really comes down to that, legal reforms, fiscal reforms, those would be the 2 major asks I think we would have of the World Bank if they're able to assist the DRC in that direction. Really, for the last 20 years, I mean, there's been light reforms in the economy, and that hasn't stopped banks from growing at the rate that they've been growing at. We've pretty much copy-pasted regulations that exist in other markets into our market, and we've tried our best to adapt to them, given that our economy is widely different. However, growth has been there. I think a third ask would be to assist the government of DRC to run a light government. We're in a country where about 90% of the tax receipts go to just servicing government payrolls. You have the same thing existing in state-owned enterprises. It's some kind of balloon package that's required as a one-off big liquidity dump in order to ensure that the government can be a light government, and then they can start helping themselves, right? We just need to create that bridge to allow the government to be able to help themselves. But as long as we're stuck into this quagmire of constantly trying to make ends meet month after month, you never get around to implementing real reforms, because governments are constantly firefighting their tomorrow's problem. It becomes very difficult to think strategically 1 year, 5 year, 10 years. So to keep it simple, I think that would be the major ask on the world side. We've been deeply encouraged by the IFC. We started a lending program with them in 2010. We see that the appetite of the IFC has grown tremendously over the last 2 years in the DRC. We welcome that. We sort of felt their approach was relatively timid in the past couple of years, but we see that it's becoming, they're being far more open. And I think that's super. I would just perhaps ask them to just adjust a little bit their risk-based models, because they tend to always refer to their risk-based models that don't necessarily apply to our markets. And then you kind of miss you were able to do business with them, but the real connection is not totally established. But we have Proparco in the market. We have TDB that's also strengthened their local office in the DRC. So we see this big wave of development financial institutions, and we welcome maybe a little bit more customization into what's available in the local market would be super. But I think we're on the right track.
Okay, thank you very much, Mustafa. So, Mary, we heard from Otoniel that Angola is on a path to reforms that will open the banking sector to increase foreign and domestic investment. We also heard from Mustafa on the sorts of things that the World Bank can do to help governments like the DRC, like Angola, and what IFC also can do in the market. So as a potential investor in maybe in Angola, what's your message for Otoniel? What would you need in order to enter Angola?
Okay, thank you. I think the first thing is look at items like the legal regime. I think obviously we've talked about legal reforms, and I think Mustafa has really talked about this in the context of DRC. I think it will apply to every market that we are looking at. So it's continuous legal regimes, just of course, because it creates a more business friendly environment for both for the investors and also for the consumers. And I think that will help a lot. I think one of the other incentives that we have seen working is, for instance, tax subsidies or incentives, not subsidies, but incentives to make it a bit easier, because setup costs are also very heavy. So if you give tax incentives to new investors, I think it's going to help their view of the market. They are going to be more driven to enter the markets within no time. In markets like DRC, I think we have encountered the lack of capital markets, for instance. So we mobilize deposits. Where do we invest those deposits? Because capital markets are not yet set up. So they need to look at, of course, integration of things like for the stock markets, integration of central banks. So even if it's not complete integration, there's good collaboration, so that as investors move from one country to the other, the operation is seamless and they're able to move things around very easily. And of course, the economic reforms, which we know are obviously going on, that is going to put more money into the public hands. There's more money for consumption, because that is what really generates the business, whether you're in banking or whether you are in fast-moving consumer goods business, whether you're in manufacturing. How do you drive cost of power, of course, electricity down? Those are the kind of things that we look at when you look at a market and assessing how friendly it is to investors. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Mary. So we are actually running out of time, and I really want to get questions from the participants. So I am going to ask you for each one of you 30 seconds. What is your message for domestic, regional, and international investors looking to Africa's frontier markets? Should they run away or should they come hither? Mary, you go first. 30 seconds, mind.
Okay, come hither. Yesterday, I think they should have come yesterday because it's a great opportunity. And I think we have a great story to tell in terms of venturing out there to the potential risky markets. I think we have seen the opportunity and we are already reaping the benefits of courage. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Otonio, 30 seconds as well.
Yes, first of all, I think that we have to believe in the financial stability that we are working in. We have a strong partners like IFC. We believe that our private sector could be boosted with this help. And also we are boosting a very strong capital market with our exchange Bolivar, because we believe that is where the business will go through. So every foreign investors that could reach our market will find these facilities as on their hands.
Thank you, Tonel. Mustafa, 30 seconds. And David, get your answer ready in 30 seconds.
Yeah. Now, international investors, I mean, there's never been over the last 20 years a shortage of international investors wanting to come to the DRC and explore the market. I think the real question is that what are we as a country doing in order to keep that is the big issue, and it comes back to the legal and fiscal reforms I've been talking about. If we're able to achieve those two, the continuous flow of investors will continue to come and they will stick. And that creates even a wider impact for more to come. So again, it's just getting the environment ready, organized, and mature enough to be able to accept investors coming in and truly accompany them. And then I think the rest just takes off on its own. So it's a pretty simple answer.
Thank you. David, 30 seconds.
I think his mic is off.
30 seconds from me. I always think if you're thinking about Africa, being a first mover is always the big step forward. First movers always get a good advantage because they understand the country probably deeper than the rest. So get in early, but have a long-term horizon about where you're going. That would be my viewpoint. Don't expect miracles in the short term, but in the long term, I think as Mustafa said, the growing pie will both suck in competition and spill out opportunities.
Okay, thank you very much. So let me go into the chat to try to capture any questions that are there. Wow, I think you guys wowed the audience. I don't see any questions in my chat. So if I can just go to technical, Frederick and Kevin, do you have any questions in the other chat? No, there are no further questions there. So what I will then say is we have 5 minutes, and I will try to use the 5 minutes in a way. I will try to use the 5 minutes and try to get you to give me a couple of short, very quick responses of the cuff. So I will say. Mary, I'll start with you. I would say Equity has been expanding. Where next are you going?
We are going to Ethiopia. We only have a rep office in Ethiopia at the moment, and we want to do full banking in Ethiopia because we believe that there's a huge opportunity to tap the market, huge population, very low banking penetration, and also not very well developed in terms of the innovative products like agency, mobile. So we feel it's our opportunity to do that. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. So Mustafa, you're up next. And I will say, what next for Raw Bank? You talked about DRC being maybe 3 different countries. What next for Raw Bank in the region? You're muted.
We have plans to stay in the DRC. We don't have any ambitions of going across border into other markets. I think the opportunity for growth in this market is probably far greater than what we see happening in neighboring countries. So we intend on fully capitalizing on that. We intend, as I said earlier, ensuring that our value proposition is in line with the times. We have formidable competitors like Equity entering the market, so we need to be on top of our game and ensure that we're constantly keeping up the good fight in this market. The DRC is effectively 3 countries in one, as you rightly said. So you kind of have to start customizing your products and your offering depending on the region that you're in. And the deeper you get into localization, the more stickiness you create with your customers. So we feel that adds sort of the best value proposition for the organization going forward. I don't really think there's any need in dispersing our energies at this stage.
Okay, thank you very much, Mustafa. Otoniel, so Angola, deepening the financial sector and also deepening other sectors for the financial sector to finance and grow the economy. What are the plans in the other sectors, and what else would you want investors looking at Angola to have in mind?
Okay, very, very interesting. We believe that as we are very young, we have a very young population. We think that technological innovation, housing consumption, areas like infrastructure, some areas that are really interesting, not only for us as a government, but also for the population, for all the people. And we believe that those areas, also with a very strong market, domestic market, will boost our economy and give the stability that we need to grow. Because we want, as David said, we want to re-emerge not only with the oil, but with all different sectors that we believe that could bring us different results. Also, we have other areas like agriculture, which is very demanding. We have plenty of lands. We believe very much in blue economy and green economy because we have a plenty of very good environment that could help to boost and bring these facilities to our economy as well. So those areas we believe that could be the main areas to boost our economy.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Otoniel. So Mustafa, Otoniel, Mary, Usman, David, thank you very much for this excellent discussion. We appreciate all your insights, and I personally feel quite optimistic about the future of the banking sector in Africa's frontier markets. So panelists, guests, viewers, thank you all for tuning in and joining this Financial Industry Summit. Please share your comments on Twitter using the hashtag AFIS2021. Please stay tuned and join the closing session.
Thank you.